Thank you for joining me today. My name is Dr. Thea Bechshoft, and I am a staff scientist with Polar Bears International. Polar Bears International is a nonprofit conservation organization, and we work to protect polar bears and, of course, also to protect the sea ice that is so essential to them. What we do is we work through media, through science and advocacy to inspire people to care about the Arctic, the threat to the future, and the connection between this remote region and our global climate. And as for our research, we're working with universities, governments, and scientists from all around the world to do long-term research. And the point, of course, of this research is to give government partners the information and the tools that they need to make the best polar bear management decisions. So in other words, we help collect the information that enables these government partners to protect polar bears in the best possible way. There we go. So this map is how polar bear researchers such as myself, we often see the world. You, of course, have the North Pole in the middle, in the middle of the Arctic Basin, and then you have the 5 polar bear nations surrounding the North Pole. So you have polar bears in Greenland, you have polar bears in Canada, in Alaska, so in the US, along the whole coastline of Russia, and then in Svalbard, which is a group of islands that are just north of Norway. So those are the 5 polar bear range nations. And there's only one species of polar bear, but it does roam far and wide. And as you can see here, there are these 19 different subpopulations or management units that researchers have divided the world's polar bears into. It just makes it easier to research them, to agree to which population we're talking about in the different research, and also to apply different rules and legislations to the different areas. So sea ice is where polar bears would be 24/7 all year round if they had that choice. And that's because for polar bears, sea ice is everything. It is where they hunt, first and foremost. Polar bears, they live off of seals, ringed seals and bearded seals primarily, and actually specifically the blubber from those seal species. But in order to be able to catch the seals, the polar bears need this stable platform of sea ice because polar bears are really good swimmers. They're very strong, but they're not very fast in the water, and especially compared to a seal. So the polar bears need this platform of sea ice that they can hunt the seals from. They also need the sea ice in order to be able to travel. For example, to go looking for seals, because keep in mind, polar bears are living in an environment that is constantly changing. So they will have to travel to find their food. They also need to travel in the springtime when it's mating season to find a potential mate. And then there's something else that, let's see the last picture here. I'm afraid you can't really see it behind the picture of me, but it says maternity denning. And that's because if the mating is successful in the spring, the pregnant female polar bear will dig a maternity den or a snow cave, if you will, where she will spend the first 3 months, where she will have her cubs there and then spend the first 3 months of their cubs' lives together with them in the snow cave before they emerge into the Arctic environment together. And this maternity den, there used to be, well, there still is some polar bear females that actually do make this den out on the sea ice, but we're seeing that as the sea ice is deteriorating, more and more of the polar bear females actually choose to den on land instead of on the sea ice. And now, of course, as we were just talking about, sea ice is essential for polar bears. Without that, they just wouldn't have access to their prey. They need that stable platform of sea ice to be able to catch the seals. that they're so reliant on. However, sea ice is not just important to the top of the food chain, which is where we find the polar bear. It's also essential at the bottom of the food chain, because this is where everything starts. When sea ice is formed in the Arctic, the salty ocean water, as it freezes, it pushes out the salt. And that means that underneath the sea ice, if you took a piece of it and flipped it around, you would see that there are these brine channels, little channels in the sea ice, underneath the sea ice, that are just full of very salty water. And there are these particular algae that thrive in this salty environment. These algae form the bottom of the Arctic marine food chain. They are eaten by zooplankton, which is slightly larger algae. The zooplankton, which in this picture is the diatoms, are eaten by tiny crustaceans. You can just about see them with the naked eye. These crustaceans are called copepods. These copepods are then eaten by the fish in the area, and then the seals, of course, will eat the fish. So if we didn't have that healthy, beautiful Arctic sea ice, the polar bear would not be able to get to the seals. It wouldn't be able to catch them. But you also would not have that whole food chain set in motion that actually makes the area an interesting one to be in for seals. So without the healthy sea ice, you would not have the food chain, you wouldn't have the seals, but also the polar bears would not be able to catch the seals. So sea ice is just really important, not just at the top of the food chain, but also at the bottom. Now, it's hard to talk about sea ice, Arctic sea ice, without also talking about climate change. And so I'm going to show you one of a couple of videos that I will show you in this talk. And I find this metaphor of the heat trapping blanket really helpful in understanding how CO2 emissions are linked to a warming climate.
Climate change is already affecting some populations of polar bears. Since we get most of our energy from fossil fuels, we are producing huge amounts of carbon dioxide. You see, regular amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere act like a blanket around the Earth, trapping heat and keeping our planet at a stable temperature. However, when we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas for energy, we pump rampant amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This buildup thickens the blanket, trapping too much heat, disrupting the climate, and melting Arctic sea ice.
Let's see. Hang on. Right. So, sorry, my slides. For polar bears, sea ice deteriorating, sea ice disappearing is an obvious problem. Because for polar bears, a healthy polar bear is a fat polar bear. They need this layer of body fat to be able to sustain them during periods of time where food is hard to get to. For example, if the sea ice disappears completely over the summer and they have to spend time on land. It's also really important, especially for the adult females, to be in good body condition, as we call it, to be fat, to have this beautiful layer of body fat. Because the female's body condition is directly tied to how many cubs she gets and how strong the cubs are, how fit they are, how able they are to survive. So what we're seeing is that in the polar bear populations where the bears are spending more time on land and they're not able to get as many seals as would be optimal, we're seeing that the bears are skinnier and the females are having fewer and smaller polar bear cubs. And it's just logic that if polar bear cubs are not healthy and if there's not a lot of them, and then we're not getting that next generation of polar bears. And if we're not getting that next generation of polar bears, then of course we see population decline. So let's see if I can start this one. Yeah, this is just to give you an impression of how much the Arctic sea ice has actually declined over time. As you can see, So this is from 1979 to 2019, I think, or 2020. You can see that it does vary from year to year. Sometimes there's a bit more, sometimes there's a bit less. But overall, it is very clear that the Arctic sea ice is disappearing, and that there is significantly less sea ice habitat for the polar bears to make their living off of now compared to just back in 1979. Hang on. Now, for all, let's see, the situation is the same for all polar bears. If you take the sea ice away, if you shorten the period of time where polar bears are able to find seals and gorge themselves on seal fat, then ultimately you're going to see that decline in population numbers that I was talking about before. However, the Arctic has been divided into 4 sea ice ecoregions, and I am going to play you a little video of our staff scientist, or sorry, our chief scientist, Dr. Steve Amstrup, where he explains a little bit more about this.
All around the Arctic, polar bears depend on the sea ice. Now, they don't eat ice, but they catch their prey from the surface of the sea ice. Polar bears have a range that's called circumpolar. That means if you looked at the top of the globe, it goes all the way around. But the sea ice isn't the same everywhere. And in 2007, I realized that it's really important for us to figure out how and why the ice is different and why bears might respond differently to it. And I came up with the concept of 4 major ice ecoregions, defined by how the ice forms, how it melts, how it moves according to ocean currents, and then how the polar bears respond. The first of these is what I call the seasonal ice ecoregion. This is the part of the world, it includes Hudson Bay and much of eastern Canada. The ice there is composed only of annual ice, and when it melts in the summer, the polar bears are forced ashore. Historically, polar bears were able to do just fine with this environment because most of this region is shallow continental shelf water and very productive. So even if bears were forced ashore for an extended period, they could gain enough weight before that happened that they could survive. They could literally live off the fat of their bodies while they were waiting for the ice to come back. The problem now is that with global warming, the ice is melting sooner and it's forming later in the fall than it used to. This means less time that bears have on the ice to catch seals, more time that they have on land waiting for the ice to come back, and during which time they're essentially food deprived. The seasonal ice ecoregion is one we know a great deal about because when polar bears are on land, they're a little bit easier to study than when they're out on the sea ice. We've gained opportunity to learn how important the sea ice is. But the ice there is very different than in most of the rest of the polar bear range. Rather than seasonal ice, the ice in the other 3 regions is multi-year or perennial ice. And that means that a big component of it remained through the summer, and historically bears could stay on that ice, continuing to feed, reaching their peak weights in the fall instead of in the spring as they do in the seasonal ice ecoregion. From Alaska all the way around the Russian Arctic to the Svalbard Archipelago north of Norway is the Divergent Ice Eco Region. Ice tends to form along the shoreline, and then it drifts away from the shoreline out into the center of the polar basin. Some of it actually is ejected from the polar basin. But the important point is that during the summer, this concept of the ice moving with the currents away from the shore means that the ice is always trying to open up and create a gap between the shoreline and the sea ice. Now, This didn't used to be a problem because when the world was cooler, the ice never retreated very far. In fact, when I went to Alaska in the early 1980s, I could stand on the North Shore in the summertime and see the ice right there. If I was lucky and had a pair of binoculars, I might even see a polar bear out there within view of the shoreline. Now that sea ice is way offshore, and that has forced polar bears into a similar challenge that they have faced in the seasonal ice ecoregion. They either have to come onto land where there's nothing for them to eat, or they follow the sea ice way out into the polar basin. And our recent studies have shown that they're not feeding when they're out there either, because the water in the deep polar basin is not very productive. Now, the ice from the Divergent Ice Eco Region is moving from shore out into the polar basin, but a lot of it piles up against the shoreline in northern Canada and also in northern Greenland. I call that area the convergent ice. The Divergent Ice Eco Region is kind of supplying ice to the Convergent Ice Eco Region. In the Convergent Ice Eco Region, polar bears historically didn't come ashore either. And the way the ice moves, even as the world has warmed, most of this area has remained good polar bear habitat throughout the summer because the ice is continually drifting against the shoreline there. The fourth ecoregion is the Archipelago Eco Region, composed of the narrow channels of water between the high Canadian Arctic islands. They're very far north, very cold, and even with global warming, ice has persisted through this area for most of the summer, and polar bears don't have to come ashore. If we allow the world to continue to warm and don't do anything about it, the last places that polar bears are likely to be is in the top of the Convergent Ice Eco Region and in the Archipelago Eco Region. But one thing we have to remember is polar bears are dependent on the sea ice, and if the world continues to warm, ultimately all of the sea ice will be gone, and we won't have polar bears in any of these ecoregions.
Now the good news. The good news is that we do have time to turn this around. We have the knowledge, we have the skills, we have the equipment. So we can absolutely turn all of this around. We can save the polar bears, we can protect the Arctic, and we can keep a livable future for everyone. So we have put together this little handout that you see here in the photo. The top actions to save our sea ice. And all of them really, the main point is that together we can make a real difference. If we leverage our voice as a community, we can convince the civic leaders that they should actually make long-term decisions that benefit the climate. So if you're of voting age, then of course voting and speaking up is one of the most important actions that you can do. So vote with the climate in mind in every election that you're able to. If you're below voting age, you still have a voice, and your voice is equally important because we really need to just talk about climate change. We need to talk about our warming planet. Every poll done out there shows that regardless of political leaning, everyone is super worried about the climate. And yet it's something that we don't talk about very much. So even if you're not able to vote, if you can commit to talking about climate change, at your job, in school, with your parents, with whichever adults you have around you, then that really makes a difference. Because if we're not talking about this, if we're not sharing our concern for the climate and the sea ice and maybe even the polar bears, then we're not going to see a lot of action. So we need to really be able to talk about this. Then, of course, there's also supporting an energy shift, promoting clean transportation, and building a better future. All of it focused on community and the difference that we can make together. I'm going to show you a short video here also. There we go.
Future generations of people and polar bears depend on the decisions and plans that we make today. The key to getting the climate back to functioning the way it should and to preserving a future for polar bears across the Arctic is to move away from using fossil fuels for energy altogether. The most important thing we can do is vote with the climate in mind to let our leaders know we support a swift transition to renewable energy sources. In the meantime, we can directly participate in and learn more about our local and regional renewable energy options. We can all make a difference outside our own households by influencing where our energy comes from. We hope you leave here feeling inspired and return home to leverage your voice and your influence, because together we can make sure that polar bears roam the Arctic sea ice for generations to come.
So this really is the most important thing to remember, is that we still have time, and together we can absolutely turn this around, protect the Arctic sea ice, protect the polar bears, and create a livable planet for all. So if you're curious for more, whether it's about climate change or it's about polar bears, please do come visit us on our website, polarbearsinternational.org. Yeah, there's more information about our research, about our team, about the policy work that we're doing. And there's also, if you're a teacher, there is a whole education center with a lot of free teaching materials, lesson plans, etc., that is free for you to use. And yeah, so please do come by and visit us. And thank you so much for joining me here today.